Of course, has attended both the recent Summit of the Americas as well as the General Assembly meeting of the states of the OAS. The OAS, as you all know, is the preeminent organization, multilateral organization in the hemisphere, and it gives the ambassador a wonderful perspective of the region. Ambassador Morales, I now have to mention to connect to our next speaker, was born in the Netherlands, which is a story that takes some minutes to tell, which I won't do. But in any case, he was educated at Columbia, overlapping with the years of the President of the United States at Columbia, the early 1980s. And not only did he attend an elite undergraduate institution, but he's a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law, one of the stronger schools of law in the nation. Ambassador Morales has worked as a international lawyer. He's worked for major international firms. In one, he was in charge of project development for the Americas, and was also their president and general manager in Argentina. He worked as a consultant in the financial area as well, and joined our government, first of all working for us as an executive director for the United States with respect to the Latin American or Inter-American Development Bank. And then more recently, of course, was appointed to his current position as the permanent representative of the United States to the Organization of American States. In talking during the period, the few minutes before beginning, probably people raised 7 or 8 significant and interesting issues, and there are more. So we all look forward, I know, to the ambassador's discussion of this wonderful range of topics which is presented by the hemisphere. Ambassador Morales.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Bird, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with all of you this evening here at the Council. I was commenting as we were having some of these lovely refreshments that I noticed there were a number of chairs that were pointing out towards the harbor, and I thought, I certainly hope my remarks are more interesting than the storm, although it's lovely to see a summer storm. You know what happens when you serve in these positions? You have all kinds of people that are helping you, and people were very excited at my having the opportunity to participate. And certainly, when you look at the types of speakers that have participated in this forum, and then, as we've just heard, the ones that are coming, people were very, very interested in getting me ready. And so they said, Mr. Ambassador, we have prepared an extensive speech for you. Because you're going to have to cover many, many topics. And here it is. It's 20 pages. And I thought, you know, it's true, and that's very good work. And you certainly want to encourage that. But what I thought I'd do tonight is, instead of subjecting you to a 20-page speech, is pass along some reflections from 2 major events that have taken place in the last several months in the Western Hemisphere. The first is the Summit of the Americas, which took place in Port of Spain in Trinidad and Tobago. And the second just concluded last week, which is the General Assembly of the Organization of American States. My role in the first meeting was to attend, but in addition to being the ambassador to the OAS, I also served as the United States National Coordinator in preparation for the summit. So it gave me shall we say, a unique perspective, so I think it would be interesting for you all to hear both the topics and perhaps some of the things that happened behind the scene. And then with the General Assembly, which just took place in San Pedro Sula, The theme of the meeting was towards a culture of nonviolence. But for those of you who have been reading the press, what was actually discussed was the issue of Cuba. So I'd like to talk to you about that as well. And I would imagine there are probably some questions that might arise as to both of these topics. And then at the end, what I thought would be very interesting is for me to have an opportunity to hear from you and perhaps have a dialogue. So I thought that might be the way we should proceed with your permission. The summit, which was in April, was an extremely significant event, not only because it's a meeting of the 34 leaders of the hemisphere, and it only happens every 3 years, but it's also important to keep in mind the context in which the development of the summit took place. The world was in a slow burn financial crisis. You also had an energy and food crisis. And then there was a real concern by the leaders in the hemisphere whether they were going to have enough resources to be able to sustain the growth and whether they were going to have enough resources to continue to make a commitment to the political and social gains that had been made. Now, what also was a factor was the fact that the previous summit, which was held in Argentina, in Mar del Plata, was not what anyone would call it was a memorable summit. It was a fairly acrimonious meeting. For those of you that may not recall, one of the events that happened on the margin of the Mar del Plata summit was President Hugo Chavez from Venezuela showing up. He held a counter rally. He had a shovel in his hand, and he said, "I'm here to bury the free trade area of the Americas." So, I mean, this was the atmosphere that came out of Mar del Plata. So people were very concerned whether this was something that was going to be replicated in Port of Spain. And frankly, there were a number of discussions in Washington whether it was a good idea to have President Obama be subjected to this type of potential situation. But at the same time, there were also concerns about whether or not we had done enough for the hemisphere. There were some that would say that we had not done enough, that we should be doing more. And so those of us who were proponents of the summit said, if you want to solidify the perception that we do not care about Latin America and the Caribbean, don't go to the summit. As we all know, he did go. But there's another important development that I think is important to keep in mind, and that is the formation of the G20. In the crises, in the past, the countries that would be convened to try to address these issues were the G8. But there was a decision to include emerging countries. And of the G20, 5 are from the Western Hemisphere. Of course, it's the United States and Canada, but Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina played a critical role. And they also played a critical role because when they came to the summit, they wanted to make sure that what had taken place in London was going to be incorporated into the decision-makings and into the discussions of the deliberations at the summit. So with all of that, we went to Port of Spain. And what happened was an extremely successful summit. And I think there are several reasons for that. I think obviously the first one is President Obama. He not only is a symbol of U.S. democracy, but he was also symbolic of a new view, a new vision, very charismatic and very engaging. And I think that was something that had a huge impact in his meetings bilaterally and also in the sub-regional meetings that he had. The other is the G20, or these 5 countries from the G20 made a critical difference. Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Canada really stepped up. And they really wanted to have a productive meeting. They wanted to be able to show that there could be a common agenda and that we could find common ground in the areas of energy, in the areas of security, in the areas of social development. These are the things that they were focusing on, and these are the things that came out of the Declaration of Commitment. So in essence, what you had was an environment where people were willing to put aside certain bilateral differences and come together as a region, as a hemisphere, as 34 democracies and say, look, we believe that the summit is important and we believe that meeting at this level is important. And I think if you think about it from the United States perspective, there's only two arenas where we can meet with all of the hemisphere. One is where I work on a daily basis, which is the OAS, and the other, at the highest level, at the presidential level, is at the summit. There are many sub-regional organizations. There's the Caribbean community, there is the Central American integration community, there's the South American, or what is called UNASUL, there's a Rio group, the Andean community. These are sub-regional groups that meet regularly, but there's only one at the highest level where all of the region comes together, and that's the summit. I think it's also the summit success is also significant for the hemisphere. The summit after the fourth, people really thought, is it worth meeting? I mean, if we're going to have counter summits and if we're going to have these types of protests, does it make sense to come together? After the fifth summit, the answer is a resounding yes. In fact, we already have a host for the sixth summit, which is going to be Colombia. It's going to be in Cartagena in 2012. So what it showed is that the hemisphere can come together, we can forge a common agenda, and I think there was another important element that emerged from the summit, which is the Caribbean. Many times when you talk about the Western Hemisphere, people focus on the Latin American countries. They do not focus enough, in my opinion, on the Caribbean countries. And of the 34 members, 14 come from the Caribbean. It was hosted in Trinidad and Tobago, and the countries of the Caribbean really took it as if it was their summit. They played a critical role in making certain that it was a successful summit. And just to give you one example, at the end of the meeting, you have what is called a declaration of commitment. And this is it's a presidential declaration that covers a wide range of issues. And at the end, it's what the leaders present. In the previous summit, at the fourth summit, the document went into the meeting open, meaning that the negotiations had not been concluded. At one point, the presidents and prime ministers of the hemisphere were actually negotiating text. This is not something that you want to see. You just believe me, this is not, you don't want to get to this level, because obviously it becomes very difficult to back down. Nobody wants to give in. I mean, if you're the one who's carrying the message from the leader, you say, my president, the prime minister says, I need to do this. It was very, very difficult in Mar del Plata, which was another part of the reason why it was not, I think, as successful a summit. By contrast, in Port of Spain, the Declaration of Commitment was concluded 2 weeks in advance. And I think it's in large part, the tribute should go to the Caribbean states. They really pushed very hard to make certain that the declaration would not be the issue at the meetings. They wanted to create an environment where the leaders could come together and talk about the issues that they felt were most important. In the end, there was some question by the ALBA countries, this is the Bolivarian alternative, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Honduras, that had expressed some concerns about the document. And there was some talk about their not accepting the document. Well, in the end, they did. It was a consensus document that all 34 countries authorized Prime Minister Manning to sign. So I think it's an extremely significant accomplishment, particularly when you contrast it against the fourth summit. I think what's also clear is there was in addition to the areas that I've mentioned, a real commitment to making certain that the most vulnerable and the poorest in our communities had the resources necessary to continue the programs. And so there was an emphasis on multilateral development banks, and in particular, the Inter-American Development Bank, which is, as you heard, where I used to work. Resources are critical, and they're going to be critical both at the public level and at the private level if these countries are going to be able to continue the growth that is necessary for them to continue to address the extreme levels of poverty that unfortunately still affect many, many countries in our hemisphere. But I think the summit was also very important for the United States. And President Obama, when he was there, announced several initiatives. And speaking of financing, one of the things that he announced was a $250 million microfinance initiative. For those of you in business, you know that if you don't have access to credit, it's extremely difficult not only to maintain a business, but to grow a business. And the smaller you are, sometimes it's even more challenging because institutions may feel that you're not a worthy or you're too much of a credit risk. Well, in order to address that, the president said we need to be out there providing these resources. He also reiterated a commitment to what's called the Inter-American Social Protection Network. And what this is, it's a network which emphasizes programs such as conditional cash transfers. For those of you that don't know what that is, these are programs where monies are provided to families, and in exchange for the resources that they receive, they make a commitment to keep their kids in school. One of the biggest challenges that we have in the hemisphere is that children, because they come from very poor families, immediately are out into the workforce trying to basically subsist. So these CCTs, as they call them, have been extremely effective, and they've been very good in Brazil and in Mexico and in other parts. And in fact, in the United States, Mayor Bloomberg has looked at this and is considering implementing a similar program. And in fact, the launch of this is going to take place in New York in September. So that's something that you should keep an eye out for. The other was energy and climate. The president announced an energy and climate partnership for the Americas. Now, this is not another sort of one-size-fits-all approach. The idea, on the contrary, is to work with those countries that want to emphasize different things, for example, whether it's renewable development or biofuels development, and say, we're prepared to work with those countries. And if countries want to do a combination of things, we're prepared to do that as well. So this was something that also came out of it. The other is a commitment to addressing programs, challenges collectively, multilateralism, a real emphasis and a willingness to engage on the multilateral level. And as I told you, there are sub-regional groups in the hemisphere. The president met with CARICOM. He met with the Central American Group. He met with UNASUL, again, to underscore this commitment to work not only bilaterally, but also multilaterally. And also, there were important meetings on the bilateral level, meetings with Venezuela. You probably saw the photograph. I can tell you a story about the book. I don't know if you remember, but there was a point where President Chavez gave the book to President Obama. And the version of the book that he gave was in Spanish. And there was a retreat on the last day, and this was part of the program where all the leaders get together and they sit. And what the Venezuelans had realized is that the president had received the book and he had received it in Spanish. So they scrambled and they found a book in English. And in the retreat, where the 34 leaders were speaking, there was an anteroom which was separated by a curtain, and I was in that room. And as you might imagine, with the president, many people travel with him, and there are people that are called White House Advance. And President Chavez made mention of the book, and there was a fellow, clearly a Venezuelan with a book, that was supposed to rush out and deliver the book. And I've never seen somebody move so fast in my life. The White House Advance guy just stuck his arm out and just stopped the Venezuelan cold in his tracks. And he asked him, he said, "Is that a book for the president?" And the guy said, "Yes." He said, "I'll take that." And so it never went to the president. And I asked him, I said, "Josh, how'd you know?" And he said, "Hector, you would never believe, you wouldn't believe how often this happens. People are constantly trying to give things to the president." But the point is, there were meetings with the Venezuelans, there were meetings with the Bolivians, there were meetings with the Ecuadorians, signaling that, and the president said this, he said, "Look, we're willing to engage in a dialogue. We're willing to perhaps consider or reconsider. But if we're going to change can't only be on one side. There's got to be change on the other side. That's the counterpart. That's got to be part of the deal. That's what we expect. That's what the United States expects. And if this is going to work, this is what has to happen." But obviously, this was very significant in terms of bilateral relations with these countries. What he also signaled in that same context was his approach to Cuba. and a new relationship with Cuba. And what he indicated is that there was going to be a two-part approach. One was increasing links to people, and the other was government-to-government interaction. With respect to the former, the links to people, you heard about the announcement where the relaxation of family travel and the ability to send more remittances. On the government, in a recent development, there's been an exchange of diplomatic notes between the Cubans and the United States. And the Cubans have agreed to enter into a dialogue on two topics. One is migration and the other is direct mail. Obviously, there's a hope that these topics will progress and there might be other opportunities to discuss other issues that are obviously of extreme concern to all of us. But also, what took place in Port of Spain was a discussion to find a way on how to reincorporate Cuba into the Inter-American system. And so that was a challenge that was taken up at the Organization of American States meeting last week. And there was a resolution, and the resolution that was passed, I think, was historic. It was historic because it addressed the 1962 resolution that suspended Cuba's participation from the OAS. But I think it's also historic because it was a reaffirmation by 34 countries to a commitment to the essential practices and purposes of the OAS. Reaffirmation of democracy, human rights, security, development, non-intervention, and self-determination. What the country said was there will not be two different types of members in the OAS. I think the decision also affirmed that there's a commitment to build partnerships, a commitment to dialogue and collaboration, and I think a commitment towards forging a better future. I think one about learning, one about listening, and one about, as I said, creating partnerships. I think what's also clear is that there was an absolute commitment to these principles. But it's up to Cuba. There's a process, and I think this is important to underscore. The resolution did address the 1962 sanction, but what it also addressed was that there's a process, and the process that Cuba has to follow in order for it to become a full member into the OAS is one they have to initiate. So they have to be the ones that say, yeah, we're prepared to come back. But if they're prepared to come back, it has to be consistent with these principles and purposes and practices of the OAS. And the practice of the OAS is a consensus-based decision-making institution. So I think it's extremely important to underscore this. During these meetings, quite frankly, we weren't sure how it was going to end. I can tell you there were many, many hours. Most of the negotiating sessions ended at 2 or 3 in the morning. The last session ended at 4 in the morning. At some point, there was a concern that certain countries were not going to accept these principles. But what was very clear was that we were not going to budge on these core issues. And I think what's also important to share with you is that it's not automatic. Cuba's not automatically coming back in. There is a process. There are parameters. It's a decision that has to be based on consensus. But how did we get there? Secretary Clinton played a critical role. She showed up, and we told her where things stood, and she participated in what was called a working group. She met with several foreign ministers, Foreign Minister Amorin, Foreign Minister Espinosa from Mexico, and others. In the room was also the Foreign Minister from Venezuela. And what she said was, if we're going to do this, we have to remain true to our fundamental principles and values. That's not negotiable. And I think it was her character, I think it was her personality, I think it was her experience, and ultimately, frankly, it was her text. I mean, she was the one who put the text on the table, and that was the text that ended up forging the consensus. So I think it was a real act of statesmanship on her part that led to the decision that ultimately we had. Now, going forward, obviously we have lots of challenges, and I'm not here to tell you that we have 34 strong democracies in the hemisphere. We don't. We have lots of challenges in the hemisphere, and it's not a question of whether you're on the right or whether you're on the left. Ultimately, it's a question of how you govern, and democracy is more than just going to the polls and voting. You've got to be in a position to deliver the benefits of democracy to the people that elected you and those that didn't elect you. And so those are the things that we're going to have to continue to address. But certainly, in the last 6 months, if you look at these two events, the Summit of the Americas and the General Assembly, it's very clear that in the midst of lots of problems and in the midst of a tremendous crisis, the countries were able to work together. The member countries did not abandon the social agenda. They didn't turn their back on the world. The leaders in Port of Spain set a direction, and the OAS General Assembly was the first test, and we passed. I think we passed because it was a reaffirmation of the core principles and values for which the organization stands for and for which 34 countries in the hemisphere have fought very hard to achieve. We're going to have to continue to fight just as hard to maintain them. But I think if we stand together the way we did and the way we have, and we continue to stand together, we'll be able to address these challenges and we'll be able to seize the opportunities that I think we can all have in the Western Hemisphere, and that obviously includes us here in the United States. So I'll stop there. It's been an honor to be with you this evening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a most interesting presentation. I'm warning the ambassador that we need to repeat our questions for our television man in the rear. So if you would, we'd appreciate it.
We've seen NAFTA, we've seen CAFTA, are we going to see SAFTA? Well, let me answer the first question. The answer to the first question is no. I didn't get to see anything other. Well, that's not true. I went to Tegucigalpa. But on previous trips, I have had a chance to travel to other parts of Honduras. And this is a promotion for Honduras. It's a beautiful country. There are some wonderful ruins in Copan that are worth going to see. And the Bay Islands are also quite nice. I've been to Roatan. So if you get a chance, I would highly recommend visiting those. In terms of free trade, I think free trade is extremely important. I'm a proponent of free trade. I think it makes and has made a big difference. I think NAFTA has been successful. I think CAFTA is showing that it can be successful. There are pending free trade agreements, and my hope is that those will at some point also be addressed and be addressed successfully. But I think what's also important, and I'm not the U.S. trade representative, but what I can tell you is this. I mean, trade in and of itself is not enough. The trade has to also address social concerns, and I think this is something that you're hearing the President talk about and Ambassador Kirk talking about. There have been concerns on the labor and environmental front that these issues have to be addressed. But I think ultimately people understand that regional integration and certainly commercial and economic integration is not only beneficial for these countries because it does help generate jobs, it's also helpful for us in the United States. It strengthens our trading, our business ties, it's job creation, and you would think today, with all the challenges that we're facing economically, being able to produce or sponsor agreements that can lead to more jobs, I think that's a both short-term, and medium, and long-term benefit. Clearly, there are issues that have to be addressed, and I think that's what the administration is looking at and working with those countries that have outstanding or pending trade agreements. How long is it going to be before not just family travel, but all people, citizens, U.S. citizens, can travel to Cuba? I think the answer is I hope someday that will happen, certainly. But right now, keep in mind, we're at the beginning of June. The administration came in at the end of January. I mean, it's only been in office for a very short period of time. And in a relatively short period of time, a tremendous amount has happened, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. I think these issues in terms of people to people and government to government are significant steps. But I think it's also important to see how these steps develop and what the reaction is before before more decisions are taken. Certainly, what we want to do is help the people of Cuba. I think that is critically important. People of Cuba deserve to be able to select their leaders. They deserve to have free and fair elections. They deserve to be able to express themselves without the fear of any sort of retaliation or retribution. And unfortunately, human rights and fundamental freedoms are not part of that society. But I think some important steps have been taken, and let's see how those develop. China is having a greater influence in the region, and what does this portend for U.S. relations with China and specifically for Latin America and the Caribbean? The Chinese, I think, practice what somebody once called resource diplomacy. But I also think that what they've been able to do in other parts of the world, I think they're finding a little bit more difficult to do in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think part of that is we have the emergence of some very strong leaders and strong countries in the hemisphere. Certainly Mexico and Brazil, I think they welcome investment, but they're not prepared, nor do they feel they need to accept the conditions under which that investment or that assistance is being offered. I think you see it in other countries like Peru and in Colombia. I think it's in the more vulnerable countries, in the poorest countries, where I think there's some concern. What's very interesting is Taiwan has been very active in the region, in at least, I think, 10 countries, and that for the Chinese has been difficult. But I would also add that China has become a member of the Inter-American Development Bank. And as a member of the Inter-American Development Bank, you agree to certain principles. My hope would be that their practices would have to be consistent with the practices that multilateral institutions are exercising. But it's certainly an issue that we're following closely. The question is, what is the difficulty or the main difficulty in having the U.S. government and the Cuban government sit down and directly negotiate? But I think the answer, I think you answered your question. But number one, we are sitting down with the Cuban government, and we're going to start a discussion in a limited area. And as I said in my remarks, we're not saying that by sitting down with you, we have decided to waver or to put aside or to express any doubt on what we feel in terms of democracy, human rights, fundamental freedoms, the rule of law. There are 34 countries in the hemisphere that have agreed to this. It's very much a hemispheric form of government and governance, and we believe that Cuba, hopefully one day, will have that. Ultimately, it has to be the people of Cuba that decide this, and we hope that they will come. But I think there's been a decision that there can be some opening and some discussion. But again, as the president said, if we're the only ones that are changing, then this isn't going to work. And so I think the president has indicated that there's some willingness in a very narrow area. And again, this has just begun. And let's see how this goes. But I don't think anybody wants to send a signal that would show any doubt on these core values and principles. That's absolutely not going to be the case. The question is, we're spending a lot of time on Cuba, and whether we're going to be able to make any progress or further progress so long as the Castro brothers are still alive. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that what's clear is the present government of Cuba was the government of Cuba back in 1962. The people of Cuba have not had an opportunity to select their leaders in a free and fair election. There are still political prisoners in Cuba. There are lots of things that have to change in Cuba. What has been interesting to follow has been the declarations made by Fidel Castro versus those made by Raul Castro. When there was talk about the possibility of entering into discussions, Raul Castro's response was, everything is on the table. And then a few days later, his older brother said, well, what my younger brother meant to say was that nothing is on the table. And then apparently a few days later, Raul said, no, everything is on the table. So I think there's some confusion within Cuba as well. Instead of Cuba, shouldn't we be more concerned about Mr. Chavez in Venezuela? And I think, as I mentioned, you know, what's going on in certain countries, and certainly Venezuela is one of them, there are reasons for concern. Technically, yes, he was elected democratically, but what's clear is that the decisions that his government has taken in certain areas really calls into question in adherence to democratic principles. I think there are real concerns in the area of human rights. The number of NGOs have expressed very serious concerns about the limitations, certainly in the areas of freedom of expression. So I think, yes, Venezuela is an area for concern, and certainly from the work that we're doing at the Organization of American States, we are promoting various groups to try to raise awareness, to raise these issues, but it's not easy, let me just say. But what's also important, and I think this is something that has happened in the past when we try to address these issues, if we're the only ones, it's very easy to criticize. I think we're more effective, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue bilateral efforts. I absolutely believe that we should. But I think the multilateral approaches, and also having countries in the region to step up, like Brazil, to try to work with countries like Venezuela, we have greater possibilities of having success. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, it's not. But if they believe that this is a concern for them on different levels, politically, national security, then I think they're likely to have a greater or a significant say. Brazil borders many, many countries. And so if Brazil is able to work effectively, and we benefit, I think that's a good thing. We should continue our efforts, but we shouldn't be the only ones. The question is that history plays an important part of this, and our history in the region has not necessarily been a positive one. So how are we going to overcome this as we go forward? Well, we have two choices. I mean, we can dwell on the past, or we can look ahead. And the president actually talked about this when he was in Port of Spain. And this was after he had to listen to a 50-minute barrage from President Ortega, who basically blamed us for everything. And he almost blamed President Obama for the Bay of Pigs. I mean, it was just, and President Obama reminded him that he was only 3 months old when that took place. But he also said, he goes, look, I'm here to talk about going forward. I'm here to talk about a new future. I'm here to work with you. I'm here to listen. I'm here to work in partnership and in respect, but also co-responsibility. And what he said was, at the end, you can't blame us for everything. You have to start assuming some of your own responsibility for some of your problems. And I thought it was a very good mix between saying, yes, I acknowledge that perhaps there's some things in the past that were unfortunate, but on the other hand, going forward, at some point, if you're going to stand up, you've got to start assuming responsibility. And what was very nice is that in a number of these plenary sessions, a number of other presidents said that. President Arias from Costa Rica made a very eloquent speech, and he said, you know, we're really good at placing the blame on others, and we've got to stop doing that, and we've got to stop doing that, and that starts with the United States. They can't always be the problem. I think that was encouraging. The question is, the OAS has asked Cuba to join, and what has been Cuba's response? That's almost an accurate question. The OAS has indicated that it would like to see the eventual reintegration of Cuba into the organization. However, there's a process by which Cuba must submit itself. One, Cuba has to initiate. They have to say that they want to come back. Two, there are parameters by which this process will be governed, and that is the principle and purposes of the OAS. So that means the OAS Charter, that means the Inter-American Democratic Charter, that means the Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, it means the Security Declaration, it means all of that. And then the decision has to be consistent with the practices of the organization, which means it has to be a consensus-based decision. What did Cuba say? They responded yesterday officially. They said no. That shouldn't come as any surprise. It's unfortunate, but it means that Cuba isn't prepared to do these things. And so for those people who said the United States has let Cuba in unconditionally, the best proof that I can provide you is their response. But more importantly, read the text. The text makes very clear that in order to sit at the table, they have to do what everybody else has done. We're not creating two classes of members at the Organization of American States. You raise a really good point. Does the OAS deal with a lot of struggle either between or among countries, and how do they deal with that? One of the most significant areas of expertise and work that the OAS does is conflict resolution. And so when there are problems, whether there are border disputes or whether there are more serious disputes, the OAS plays a critical role. A fact that I didn't know until I was at the OAS, there are more than 200 existing border disputes in the region. And that's not something that you would ever, at least I didn't think. When I arrived, just to share a personal anecdote, I arrived in March 12th of last year. And I was at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I had been nominated, but nomination process is slow. And I didn't know whether I was ultimately going to get confirmed. And then all of a sudden, this very serious outbreak takes place between Colombia and Ecuador. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a raid that the Colombian army did on a FARC encampment in Ecuador. And the Ecuadorians claimed that the Colombians had violated the principle of non-intervention. They had violated their sovereign territory. The Colombians argued that they were merely exercising self-defense. In the raid, a FARC leader, Raul Reyes, was killed, but President Correa was very, very upset. And then President Chavez became very upset. He wasn't involved, but he inserted himself, and he did that by ordering 10 tank battalions to the border between Venezuela and Colombia. So they called a meeting of, it's called a consultation of foreign ministers, and all of a sudden I get confirmed. And they said, Hector, you got to go. And so that was my very first meeting. I was in this negotiating session with, at the time, and someone who has spoken here, Ambassador Negroponte. We were the ones that were in the negotiating sessions. Fortunately, war did not break out. A consensus resolution was reached. But I use it as an example, maybe an extreme example, of where it was critically important to reach a hemispheric decision. And there was only one place where you could do that, where all 34 countries were present, and that was at the OAS. There had been a meeting earlier of the Rio group in Santo Domingo. And it helped. I don't want to take anything away from it. But in order to make it a resolution, and a hemispheric resolution, it had to come to the OAS. So it's one of the very significant aspects that the OAS does. And the other is election observation. The question is, what is the status of the free trade agreement with Colombia? The answer is I don't know. As I said earlier, Panama and Colombia, those trade agreements are still pending. The administration I think, had expressed some concerns initially on the areas of labor and the environment. And I know that the Colombians, there have been many, many discussions with the Colombians. I know there have been a number of congressional delegations that have gone to Colombia, also to Panama. I know Ambassador Kirk, he was with us at the summit, and this was very much one of the topics. As I said earlier, I think it's important to get the passage of these free trade agreements, I think. But I also think that the areas that have been raised need to be addressed. And my hope is that these will be addressed and that eventually we will see agreements that make sense and get passed. The question is, at the summit, was there a discussion about the role of the participation of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, because in the past, their history with certain countries in the region has been less than, I'm embellishing, has been difficult. The conversations really were more, yes, the IMF was part of those discussions. I mean, when you talk about resources and balance of payment financing, you have to talk about the IMF. But there was also talk about the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. The summit has what's called the Joint Summit Working Group, and it's made up of various organizations, and among them include the World Bank, the IDB, CABE, which is the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, CDB, which is the Caribbean Development Bank, CAF, which is the Andean Development Corporation. And so there was a real concern that you have these social and economic programs that these countries are financing, and are they going to be able to continue to finance them, number one. Number two, do these organizations, which have traditionally been designed to be counter-cyclical, are they going to have the resources available to be able to continue these programs? And then the other, and this goes back to the G20 discussion, if you saw what the G20 finance ministers did, they specifically addressed the IMF, and they talked about making sure that the IMF had enough resources. And the biggest contributor was the United States. And so this was another expression of how the United States is committed to multilateralism and committed to financing. And there was also the creation of certain instruments, a flexible line of credit, that certain countries have looked at. They may not need them, but it was an idea to create stability and also to create confidence so that investors would not pull out. Mexico is an example of that. Nicolás Izaguirre, who is a director for the Western Hemisphere at the IMF, I think is quite good. The question is, you have China, and then you have Cuba. China is far away, but obviously there's similarities between China and Cuba. And then Cuba is right here, and is in some way is the OAS limiting our ability to interact with Cuba. I think the answer, and I don't mean to sound clever, what's limiting Cuba's interaction with us and the OAS is Cuba. I think that the decision about the type of government that it wants to have is a decision that the people of Cuba have to make. What we wanted to signal using the General Assembly was that the emphasis should be on those principles and values that are inherent to membership of all the countries of the hemisphere. The countries of the hemisphere have made a commitment to democracy. That's in the Western Hemisphere. That's what we believe, and that's what we support. And not only that, in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we say that democracy is a right. It's a right of all the people of the hemisphere, and that every country has an obligation to promote and to defend it. And so we all hope that someday Cuba will join the rest of the countries and have a similar governance structure. I think the OAS stands ready to help, but again, the way the resolution is stated, it's up to Cuba. They're the ones that have to initiate the process, and they are the ones that have to make a commitment to these principles and values. And as what we wanted to signal is we hope that happens. But as the gentleman asked me, when they were asked the question, they gave us a resounding no.
He's not going to get off quite as easy as he might like. Let me raise a couple of things that have been raised earlier. The first is that of Iran's influence in Latin America, which is not often discussed, but is significant. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, secondly, you had remarked about the vitality economically and the recovery process within the hemisphere. Mm-hmm. And those two questions are certainly large. And then perhaps a quick comment on the huge question of narcotics in the area. You're all going to stay till midnight if you don't mind.
I think when many people ask what is the biggest concern that we should have in the Western Hemisphere, and people raise questions like drug trafficking and arms trafficking, which are very serious, or weak governance, poverty, inequality. Those are very serious concerns. But I think one that doesn't get discussed enough and is a very real concern is Iran, the influence that Iran is having in the region. Venezuela, Bolivia, I was mentioning this earlier, the largest embassy in Managua is from Iran. And so you ask yourself, why is this? And so these are serious concerns. And what I should also tell you is that these are not only concerns shared by us. There are concerns that are shared by a number of the countries in the hemisphere. So security is extremely important. And again, it goes back to these commitments that we've undertaken. These documents do mean something. And hopefully we don't have major security problems. But if we do, we stand ready to work together. But that's one issue. The other, you asked me about narcotics trafficking. And it's related to the security issue. Certainly democracy is important. In order to have development, you need to have democracy. They're mutually reinforcing, but they're not sustainable if you don't have a secure environment. And security now is becoming more and more a challenge, public security. And then when you see challenges towards economic opportunity, we see people move towards illicit activities. You see the emergence of gangs. This is something that's a big concern in the Central American countries. And then certainly in the Caribbean, it's an issue. But then the other point that you hear from the hemisphere is, well, it's true, there are large drug producers. They're merely responding to demand. And so these are the types of things that are very much part of the discussions. There are important meetings that are going to be taking place. There's what's called MISPA, which is an acronym that stands for a meeting of public ministers that's going to be taking place in Santo Domingo. We don't have a minister of public security. So it's divided between the Attorney General, General Holder, and Janet Napolitano from Homeland Security. The first meeting was held last year in Mexico. The next meeting is going to be held, as I said, in the Dominican Republic, specifically to address these types of concerns, and a commitment that we need to work collectively to try to address them. And then the other was, you asked me about the economy. Notwithstanding all of the challenges, I think it has been really pleasantly surprising to see the resilience of the countries in the hemisphere in the face of these tremendous economic and financial crises. And I think part of it is that in the last decade, certainly, and while there was a lot of criticism of organizations like the IMF, most of these countries undertook to implement orthodox macroeconomic policies. And those policies have held fast, both monetary and fiscal. And so now that they have more reserves than they were able to have than in the past. And so I think they were better placed. Now, long term, is that going to continue? Well, long term, in order to be successful, they're going to have to continue, in my view, have an open market approach. And they're going to also have to create an environment that's conducive for investment, because they do not have enough internal resources in order to meet the demands that they have, either socially, but certainly in the areas of infrastructure. So this is going to be an ongoing issue.
Those were pithy and important. It's been a marvelously informative evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.